8 months after the battle with House Crimson Dawn, the Coalition had grown into a formidable force, spanning 73 different species, who each brought unique abilities and technologies to the Alliance. Lyra stood in the war room aboard the Coalition flagship called Heart of Unity, studying holographic projections showing void movements across multiple sectors simultaneously. Beside her, Mira coordinated with strike teams across 20 different star systems, while Ember had become an unexpected symbol of hope broadcast across Coalition worlds as Proof Admiral Walsh said heavily that the pattern was becoming clear, and every staging ground they destroyed, every victory they won, had been pushing them toward one specific sector. Highlighted a region of space known as the Nexus Point, where dimensional barriers between realities were thinnest and most vulnerable to being torn open completely. Jacob said quietly that if the Void opened a full gateway at that location, they could bring through their entire force at once, including everything they had been hiding. Captain Pierce asked how they could stop such a catastrophic event, and Dr. Maya Lin, the Coalition chief scientist, entered with data that made everyone blood run cold. She explained that their projections showed the gateway would open in 72 hours, and once active, the energy required to close it would require destroying the Nexus Point itself. Mira asked what that meant, though Lyra could see her twin sister already understood the terrible implications, and Dr. Lin said they needed to create a counter-explosion. She continued that they would need to channel every available power source directly into the Nexus Point at the exact moment the gateway opened to collapse dimensional barriers. Lyra said flatly that this plan included using Ember as the primary power source, and the war room fell into heavy silence as everyone realized what was being asked. Jacob protested immediately, saying there had to be another way, but Dr. Lin said honestly there was not. And Ember's telepathic voice resonated, saying she had known since. The dragon continued that Starfire did not just burn darkness, but could seal dimensional rifts permanently, and one dragon giving everything at the right moment could close. Lyra said firmly that they would find another way, and refused to accept losing Ember. But the dragon said gently that she had always known this day would eventually come. Ember added, the dragons were not truly immortal despite living for centuries, and they simply burned longer than most other beings. And she wanted to burn bright enough. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of desperate preparation as every ship and weapon and soldier was mobilized for what everyone understood would be the final battle. The Coalition fleet numbered in the thousands now, which was a testament to what humanity had built in less than 1 year through determination and keeping promises. Lyra could not focus on strategy or tactics because she spent every available moment with Ember, remembering 5 centuries of friendship and shared experiences together. Ember had been there when Lyra took her first steps as a child and had taught her to fly on dragon back through Ethermore crystal forests before the wars destroyed everything. The dragon had stood beside Lyra through countless wars and devastating losses, and now she was preparing to make the ultimate sacrifice to save species she had just met. Lyra admitted the night before the final battle that she was not ready to lose her closest friend and companion, and Ember said softly that nobody was ever ready. The dragon added that Lyra would endure because she had found new purpose and family with Jacob and his people, and they would need her wisdom when this was over. Ember said that Starfire did not truly die, but transformed into light between stars, and she would always be watching over Lyra, even if not in the familiar physical form. On the day of the final battle, the Coalition fleet assembled at the Nexus Point, and the Void Collective arrived in overwhelming force, with numbers beyond counting. Their gateway began tearing reality apart, with a sound like the universe itself screaming, and Admiral Walsh's voice echoed across every vessel saying, "Today they fought for freedom." She continued that they had been tested and bloodied and pushed to their absolute limits, but they were still standing, and they would make sure the Void never threatened anyone. The battle that followed would be remembered for generations across the galaxy, as human ships and alien vessels fought side by side. Combining magic and technology, Lyra and Mira led desperate boarding actions against Void constructs using ancient blade work enhanced by human weapon systems, while their soldiers fought with incredible courage. Jacob coordinated overall strategy from the command center, and his tactical genius allowed the Coalition to hold their formations despite being vastly outnumbered by the enemy. But the gateway kept growing larger, and reality continued tearing apart as the Void True Army began emerging from the spaces between dimensions with terrifying power. Ember said through mental communication that it was time and she was going in, and Lyra started to protest. But the dragon interrupted gently, saying no more waiting. The dragon added that this was her choice and her purpose, and she asked them to let her do what she was meant to do. And Lyra felt tears streaming down her face. Ember launched from the heart of unity, and her golden form blazed like a second sun as she dove directly toward the gateway center, while every coalition ship channeled remaining power behind Ember. Hundreds of focused energy beams followed her path, amplifying her strength, and Lyra watched through the viewport with Mira, hand squeezing hers tightly. As Ember reached the gateway center, she released everything in 5 centuries of accumulated starfire exploded with power beyond anything physics could measure or explain. The explosion was not fire or light, but something beyond either, which was pure creation energy and the complete opposite of the void consuming darkness. The gateway collapsed violently, and with it, every void construct within 1,000 light years was destroyed, and their army emerging between dimensions was torn apart. When the blinding light finally faded, the nexus point was empty, with no gateway, and no void ships and no golden dragon visible anywhere in the empty space. But in the aftermath, as the coalition fleet regrouped and counted their dead, something strange began happening across every ship and every wounded soldier. Injuries were sealing faster than medically possible, and pain was lessening without explanation, and every viewport showed the same thing, which was stars burning brighter. Mira whispered that Ember had kept her promise and become part of the light itself, just as she said she would, and Lyra felt warmth that had nothing to do. The war was over because the Void Collective, with their gateway destroyed and army scattered, retreated to the furthest reaches of space where they would take centuries to recover in. The weeks following victory, the coalition transformed from military alliance into something greater, which was the foundation of a new galactic community built on cooperation. Species that had hidden in isolation for generations emerged, bringing knowledge and culture and hope, and Lyra and Mira became ambassadors bridging ancient magic and young science. Jacob rose to lead coalition military forces, though he spent much time teaching the next generation that true strength came from unity, rather than domination or conquest. On the anniversary of the final battle, they gathered at the Nexus Point, which was now called Ember Rest, and where the gateway had stood was now something beautiful. A golden nebula pulsed with warmth and life in the space where Ember had made her sacrifice, and Jacob said, standing beside the sisters, that the dragon would have liked. He added that Ember was being remembered not for her death, but for what her sacrifice had created, and Lyra said, with absolute certainty, that the dragon was not dead. She explained that she could feel Ember presence in every warm breeze and every unexpected moment of hope, and the dragon was out there watching over all of them. Always. Mira asked if they would see Ember again, and Lyra said maybe not in this life, but the story was not over because the galaxy was healing and species were uniting. She continued that for the first time in centuries, fear did not rule the darkness, and that was Ember legacy, and what the dragon had given to every living being. A ship approached called the Dragon Promise, and it was crewed by mixed teams of humans and elves on a mission to explore uncharted regions and find species still hiding. Their mission was to spread the message that darkness no longer reigned unchallenged, and that unity was stronger than any single species could ever be. Alone. Jacob said thoughtfully that when he crashed on Ethermore and made his promise to return, he never imagined it would lead to all of this galactic transformation. He added that he just knew he owed the sisters a debt, and Lyra asked what he thought now after everything they had accomplished together. Jacob said he was glad he kept his promise because look what 7 days of waiting had created, which was a friendship that ultimately saved the entire galaxy. As they watched the Dragon Promise leap into hyperspace, carrying hope to distant stars, Lyra smiled, because the war was over, but real work was just beginning. They would build a galaxy where no species stood alone, and where darkness could be faced together, and where even the shortest-lived races could create eternal legacies. Somewhere in the Golden Nebula, She felt Ember approval, warm as sunlight and bright as hope itself. And Lyra knew the dragon was proud of what they had accomplished. The twin sisters had waited 7 days for a human who promised to return, and in doing so they found not just salvation, but purpose. 4 months had passed since the devastating battle in the void reaches, and the galaxy was changing rapidly as word of humanity victory spread to species that had hidden in fear. For generations, Lyra stood in the newly established Joint Command, center on Earth, watching through massive windows as Ember soared over mountains with her strength fully restored. Those silver scars now marked her golden scales. Admiral Walsh was explaining during the morning strategy briefing that 37 different species had formally requested alliance with humanity, and they were becoming targets for different reasons. Now Captain Pierce said that this was not a burden they had asked for, and Jacob agreed, but added that they now had this responsibility, and the question was what they would do with it. Mira, who had become the chief trainer for the Coalition mixed-species combat units, said firmly that they needed to prepare, because the Void would never forgive what had been done. Intelligence reports showed Void activity increasing at the edges of known space, and they were changing tactics, becoming more careful and methodical in their approach to warfare. Lieutenant Carter rushed into the briefing room carrying urgent data and announced they had received a distress signal from the Meridian system, where a colony world was under attack. He explained that the attackers were not the Void Collective, but instead were elven forces, and Lyra blood turned ice cold as she demanded to know which house was responsible. Carter said the attackers were from House of Crimson Dawn, and they were demanding the return of what they called stolen property, and they were specifically hunting for Lyra and Mira. The briefing room fell into shocked silence, and Jacob turned to Lyra with a carefully neutral expression, asking her to explain what was happening and why elves were attacking. Lyra closed her eyes against rising shame from the past, and explained that before Ethermore fell, there had been a terrible schism among the noble houses about how to fight. She continued that House Crimson Dawn had believed the only way to defeat the Void was to become like them, and they practiced forbidden dark magic that consumed other elves. The Dark Elves gained power by draining life force from their own people, and Mira added quietly that she and Lyra had testified against them at the Grand Council, which led Admiral Walsh asked how powerful these Dark Elves were, and Lyra said grimly that they were powerful enough to destroy an entire colony world without difficulty. She explained that House Crimson Dawn would have spent years in exile perfecting their dark magical arts, and if they were now working with the Void Collective, then the Alliance. Jacob finished her sentence saying they had an entirely new problem, and asked how long until they could reach Meridian system to help the colonists under attack. Captain Pierce checked navigation data and reported 6 hours at maximum speed, and Jacob said they would leave in 10 minutes and asked if the sisters could face their own people. Lyra met his gaze steadily and said that the Dark Elves stopped being their people the moment they chose to consume innocent lives for power, and, yes, they would do what needed. The journey to Meridian was tense, with every crew member preparing mentally for a battle against an enemy that combined ancient elven magic with centuries of dark practices. Ember rode in the valiant, expanded cargo bay, and her presence provided comfort to the sisters who had not faced their own kind in combat since before their world died. As they approached the Meridian system, the devastation became horrifyingly clear, with 3 colony settlements burning, and their populations fleeing in whatever ships they could find. Carter reported detecting one large vessel in orbit around the planet, and it had elven design, but was heavily modified with dark magic signatures radiating from every section. Captain, Pierce ordered communications to hail the enemy vessel, and the face that appeared on screen was familiar and filled with hatred from the past. Lord Valen of House Crimson Dawn appeared, and his once beautiful elven features were now twisted by the dark magic he had embraced for so many years in exile. His eyes were completely black voids, and shadows seemed to cling to his form like living creatures, and his voice was like poisoned honey as he spoke directly to Lyra. He said how generous it was for Lyra Starweave to deliver herself to them, because they had been searching since Ethermore fell, and she had committed treason against her own kind. Lyra shot back that Valen and his house were exiled for consuming the souls of innocent elves, and she and Mira had only done what was right by testifying against their evil, Valen laughed cruelly and said that right was a concept for the weak, and they had allied with humans who were barely more than children playing with ships they did not understand. Mira stepped forward beside her sister and said that Valen House had betrayed everything the elven people were supposed to represent as protectors and guardians of life. She added that the dark elves had become parasites feeding on others, and Valen's expression darkened with rage as he said enough talk and gave them 1 minute to surrender. He said they must turn themselves over, or the colonists below would die, and the transmission cut off, leaving the bridge in tense silence. As everyone waited for orders, Jacob asked what their options were, and Lyra said honestly that they could not win a straight fight, because dark magic gave the Crimson Dawn strength far beyond normal elves. Olivia, who had been working frantically at her weapon station, said that dark magic left a specific energy signature, and she could modify their weapons to disrupt it. She explained that she needed time to complete the modifications, and Admiral Walsh said grimly that time was something they did not have with thousands of colonists in danger. Ember's telepathic voice suddenly resonated through everyone's minds, startling the human crew members who were still not accustomed to dragon mental communication. The dragon said she had an idea, and suggested that they let the Dark Elves capture her, because she would be a prize they could not resist taking aboard their ship. Lyra immediately said absolutely not, and refused to even consider putting Ember in such danger. But the dragon insisted. They listened to her complete plan before rejecting it. Ember explained that she could disrupt their dark magic from inside their ship, while human weapons struck from outside, creating a coordinated attack they could not defend against. Mira protested that it was too dangerous, but Ember said calmly that it was the only way to save the colonists, and asked if they trusted the humans they had allied with. Lyra looked at Jacob, who met her gaze steadily, and said quietly that it was Ember's choice to make, and he would not order it, but if she was willing, then they would support. 20 minutes later, Lyra stood in the cargo bay watching as Ember prepared to board a shuttle wearing neural suppressors that made her appear captured and helpless. To scanners, Lyra pressed her forehead against Ember's scaled snout and said if the dragon died doing this, she would never forgive her, and Ember replied that she would simply have to survive. The plan worked almost perfectly because Valen accepted Ember capture eagerly, and he was too consumed by greed to question why such a valuable prize had come so easily. Once aboard the dark elven ship, Ember waited patiently until she was brought to the ship core, where the accumulated dark magic was strongest and most concentrated. Then she released everything she had been holding back, and starfire exploded through the Crimson Dawn ship, burning away centuries of stolen power and accumulated darkness. The Dark Elves screamed as their power fled, leaving them weak and mortal once again, and Valen shouted in rage as he realized he had been tricked by a dragon. Jacob gave the order, and the valiant modified weapons struck with perfect precision, disrupting dark magic without destroying the ship. Because they needed evidence of crimes committed, Lyra and Mira led a boarding party fighting through corridors, and they found Valen on the bridge, no longer a powerful Dark Lord, but a withered elf. He spat that they had won nothing because the void would still consume everything and humanity would die while elves endured through the coming darkness. Lyra bound him with suppression cuffs and said that maybe humans would die, but they would die free, and asked if Valen could say the same about his corrupted existence. The aftermath brought unexpected revelations because among the prisoners were elves who had been forced into service with their families held hostage as leverage. These freed elves provided valuable intelligence about something disturbing, which was that the Void had indeed allied with House Crimson Dawn and promised them power in exchange. Admiral Walsh said during debriefing that this was clearly a coordinated campaign, with the Void feeding Dark Elves power while they destabilized Alliance worlds and forced resources. Jacob said it was time to change the game, because they had been reacting to enemy moves, and now they needed to take initiative and make their own moves. Lyra studied star charts, thinking through possibilities, and said the Void had hidden staging grounds where they gathered forces, and if they could find and strike before the enemy captain. Pierce said they would need deep intelligence, and that required infiltration into Void-controlled territory. And Mira smiled grimly, saying they knew someone who had spent years. She gestured toward Valen's broken form in his cell, and explained that the elves forced into service might know his contacts and information sources about Void locations. Jacob said they could trace connections to the void and find enemy staging grounds before the darkness found them first, and everyone agreed, despite the obvious risks. Around the strategy table, heads nodded in agreement. 6 months had passed since the first battle with the Void Collective, and the USS Valiant had become a powerful symbol across the growing alliance, showing that cooperation between different species could create something stronger than any single race alone. Lyra walked through the ship-expanded training facility, watching human soldiers practice combat techniques alongside elven refugees that Jacob had personally rescued from 3 other dying worlds scattered across the galaxy. Her twin, Sister Mira, was instructing a large group in ancient fighting methods passed down through countless generations, while Ember had become an unlikely guardian and protector, as the soldiers' children often played safely in her shadow. Today, Lyra's mind was focused elsewhere, as she approached the strategic planning room where Jacob and Captain Pierce were meeting with representatives from the Human Defense Coalition to discuss urgent military matters. Admiral Patricia Walsh was a severe woman, with iron-gray hair and eyes that had witnessed too many battles, and she was saying that they could not seriously consider taking the offensive fight directly to the Void. The Admiral explained that they were discussing an assault into the Void reaches, which was a nightmare region of space where reality itself grew thin and unstable, and no military expedition had ever returned alive from that cursed place. Jacob countered firmly that waiting was not a viable strategy, because every day they delayed meant another world consumed and another species destroyed, and they had proven they could hurt the Void. So now Admiral Walsh turned as Lyra entered and asked what their elven expert thought about this dangerous plan, since the sisters had fought the Void longer than any living being in the Alliance. Lyra studied the star map displayed holographically on the strategy table, and the Void reaches glowed red with danger markers, and she said quietly that the Admiral was correct about it being suicide. She added that Jacob was also correct about it being necessary, because the Void never stopped consuming, and they did not negotiate terms, and if the Alliance did not face them at their source, they would fight. Admiral Walsh said heavily that she could only spare 3 ships from the defense fleet, because losses in recent skirmishes had been severe, and Captain Pierce replied with dark humor that 3 ships to invade cosmic hell. Jacob said they would make those 3 ships. Count and Olivia Grant entered the room carrying data with barely contained excitement, showing on her usually calm face. Olivia explained rapidly that she had been analyzing Void attack patterns from previous engagements, and she had discovered a critical weakness in their dimensional manifestation process. She continued that the Void Collective was strongest when existing in the darkness between dimensions, but when they manifested physically to attack, there was a brief moment where they became vulnerable. Jacob asked how vulnerable they became, and Olivia said vulnerable enough that a coordinated strike using Ember Starfire as the core weapon might create a devastating chain reaction through their staging ground. Admiral Walsh said, dryly, that this was all theoretical, and Olivia admitted that was true, but added it was better than most theories she had heard in her career as a weapons specialist. Over the next 3 weeks, the Valiant and 2 sister ships called the Defiant and the Resolute prepared for an operation that would either make history or end humanity's brief attempt at becoming. Mira trained a special strike team composed of both human and elven soldiers in advanced magical combat techniques that combined ancient wisdom with modern tactical approaches. Ember worked daily with Olivia to refine the Starfire weapon system and pushed herself to dangerous limits that left her golden scales dimmed and her massive body exhausted. Each night, Lyra found herself drawn deeper into human military structure, and her strategic knowledge of Void tactics proved invaluable during planning sessions that lasted long into the night shifts. She also discovered something unexpected, which was a genuine sense of belonging that she had not felt since before the wars destroyed Ethermore and scattered her people across dying worlds. These humans, with their incredibly short lives and inexhaustible determination, had given her something her own ancient people never could, which was a family born from choice rather than blood. The night before their departure, Lyra found Mira and Ember on the observation deck, staring silently at the infinite stars that surrounded their ship in all directions. Mira asked softly if Lyra was afraid of what they would face in the Void reaches, and Lyra admitted honestly that she was terrified, but added that fear meant they understood what Ember rumbled deeply, and her telepathic voice touched both sisters' minds, saying that they had lived in fear for so long, and perhaps it was time they made fear itself become afraid. The journey to the void reaches took 5 days of constant travel, and as they crossed the threshold into that nightmare region, reality itself seemed to protest their presence violently. The stars appeared wrong, and their light bent in physically impossible ways, and the darkness between them was too dark, as if the void itself was alive and watching. Lieutenant Ben Carter reported from the bridge that they were detecting void signatures, and there were multiple contacts numbering in the hundreds surrounding them on all sides. Captain Pierce ordered all ships to battle stations and commenced Operation Starfire, which was the name they had given to their desperate plan to strike at the heart. The 3 human ships moved into precise formation, creating a triangle with the Valiant at the forward point, and Ember launched from the cargo bay with her scales glowing brighter. Then the Void Collective struck with overwhelming force, and they came in massive waves, and their shadowy forms blotted out the stars completely as they surrounded the small fleet. But this time, the humans and their allies were fully prepared, and Olivia-modified weapons tore through. The Void ships firing rounds that carried fragments of Starfire magic Mira led her specially trained strike team in desperate combat against void creatures that boarded their ships, and her ancient blades sang through the air as it cut through beings on the bridge. Lyra stood beside Jacob, coordinating the entire fleet movements with efficiency, born from perfect trust and months of training together for exactly this moment. They had planned extensively for this battle, but nothing could truly prepare them for the overwhelming numbers they faced as more void ships kept appearing from dimensional rifts. Olivia reported that Ember was in position and charging the primary weapon system, and through the viewport, Lyra watched her dragon companion dive toward the largest void construct. The construct was a massive tear in reality itself that pulsed with malevolent energy and seemed to be the source from which all the other void ships were emerging. Ember flames grew brighter and hotter and more intense than Lyra had ever witnessed in 5 centuries of knowing the dragon, and the heat signatures were going off the scale. Jacob gave the order to fire, and the Starfire weapon discharged with tremendous force, and it was a beam of pure, magical energy channeled through advanced technology. The beam struck the void construct dead center, and for a long moment, nothing happened, and Lyra's heart stopped beating as she feared their desperate plan had failed. Then reality itself screamed, with a sound that could not be heard but was felt in every soul aboard every ship, and the construct exploded not with fire but with blinding light. The light was pure creation energy, and it was the complete opposite of the void-consuming darkness, and it spread like a shockwave through the void reaches, burning everything. Everywhere the light touched, the shadow beings burned away, and their screams echoed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, as they were destroyed by forces they could not resist. But victory came with a terrible cost, because the explosion backlash caught Ember and hurled the dragon away from the blast with devastating force. Lyra felt her companion pain through their ancient bond and felt Ember life force flickering weakly like a candle in a storm, and she shouted desperately to get the ship. The Valiant raced at maximum speed to retrieve the fallen dragon, while the Void Collective retreated in complete disarray with their numbers decimated and their staging. Ground-destroyed medical teams rushed to stabilize Ember massive form, and Lyra knelt beside her dragon head with tears streaming down her face and her hands pressed against warm scales. The dragon golden eyes opened weakly, and her mental voice was barely a whisper asking if they had won the battle, and Lyra said with a breaking voice that yes. Ember thought response came slowly, saying that was good, and then her consciousness faded into deep healing sleep, and the medical teams worked frantically to save her life. Jacob placed a comforting hand on Lyra's shoulder and said quietly that Ember was incredibly strong, and she would survive this because dragons were nearly impossible to kill. Lyra said she knew that, but as she looked at the stars, now visible again without the void shadow covering them, she understood this war was far from over. The Void Collective had existed for thousands of years, and they had won an important battle, perhaps the most critical battle, but the enemy would adapt and evolve and return stronger. Jacob seemed to read her thoughts and said that when the Void came back, humanity and all their allies would be ready, and they would keep fighting until darkness, as repair crews worked on damaged ships and medical teams tended to wounded soldiers, and the Alliance counted their losses. Lyra felt both triumph and sorrow. They had struck a devastating blow against an enemy that had seemed invincible, but the cost. 3 months had passed since the rescue, and Lyra stood in the training hall of the human military ship called the USS Valiant, watching her twin sister Mira spar with a human soldier named Kate Morrison, who moved with impressive speed and determination. Mira flowed like water across the training mat, and her ancient elven blade danced through the air with centuries of practiced skill behind every movement, while Kate adapted quickly, using her human determination to compensate for her lack of magical. Enhancement Commander Jacob Hayes approached Lyra silently because he had learned stealth techniques from spending months training alongside the elven sisters, and he said quietly that Kate was improving rapidly for a human warrior. Lyra replied that Kate was good for a human, but there was warmth in her voice because in 3 months among humans she had learned that they possessed something her own ancient people had lost many centuries ago, which was the ability to hope despite facing impossible odds. Jacob's expression grew serious, and he said he needed to talk about Ember, because they had intercepted enemy communications, and the Void Collective knew about the dragon, and they were specifically hunting for her across multiple star systems. Lyra's blood turned cold in her veins, and she asked which Void faction was leading the hunt, and Jacob explained that it appeared to be a coordinated effort from their main force, which meant they considered Ember a significant threat, worth dedicating resources. The Void Collective was the ancient enemy that had destroyed the elven homeworld of Ethermore by manipulating the 5 kingdoms into civil war, and then feeding on the resulting chaos and death like parasites consuming. A dying host. Ember was not just any dragon but a starfire dragon, and she was one of only 3 remaining in the entire known galaxy, and her flames possessed unique properties that could actually burn through the Void Collective's shadowy forms that existed partially outside normal reality. Lyra said grimly that the Void could come and try to take Ember, but they would find the dragon well protected, and her hand moved instinctively to rest on the blade at her hip that had been in her family for countless generations. Jacob said quietly that he was not asking if Lyra would defend Ember, because that was obvious, but rather he was asking if she trusted humans enough to help turn the dragon from a target into a weapon that the Void had never faced before. Lyra could respond. An alarm shrieked through the ship with a deafening sound, and the lights shifted to emergency red coloring, and Jacob's communication device crackled to life with urgent voices reporting incoming threats. The voice on the communication device said that they had multiple Void signatures appearing around the entire human fleet, and the enemy was not attacking yet, but instead surrounding them in a tactical formation that blocked all escape routes. Jacob and Lyra sprinted through the corridors toward the command bridge, where Captain Helen Pierce was rapidly coordinating defensive positions and giving orders to multiple ship captains simultaneously through her command station. The main view screen showed the terrifying reality of their situation, with dozens of Void ships surrounding the fleet, and these were not normal vessels, but rather tiers in reality itself that had been given form and purpose and dark intent. The communications officer named Lieutenant Ben Carter reported with a pale face that the Void forces were attempting to establish contact, and Captain Pierce ordered him to put the transmission on the main screen immediately. The image that appeared was something from ancient nightmares and legends, because it was a being of pure shadow and starlight, whose form constantly shifted and changed and seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Void being spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and it said that humans harbored something that belonged to the eternal darkness, and they should surrender the Starfire Dragon and her keepers immediately. The shadow creature added that if humans refused this simple demand, then the Void would teach them why 1,000 different civilizations across galactic history had learned to fear the consuming darkness and had hidden rather than fight. Jacob stepped forward boldly and said he had a counteroffer for the Void Collective, which was that they should leave immediately, and then humans would not turn their entire fleet into target practice for the newest alliance in the galaxy. The Void being laughed, and the sound was like entire worlds dying in agony, and it said that humans were foolish because they could not fight what they could not physically touch with their primitive weapons and technology. Mira's voice rang out clearly as she entered the bridge, still wearing her training gear alongside Kate, and she said that maybe humans could not touch the Void, but elven warriors certainly could with their ancient magic. In the cargo bay, far below the bridge, Ember roared with a sound that reverberated through the entire ship structure, and Lyra felt it in her bones because it was the ancient rage of dragons who had fought the void since before humans had even dreamed of traveling. Captain Pierce asked Jacob what humanity did best when facing impossible odds, and Jacob smiled, but it was not a kind or friendly expression, and he said that humans improvised better than any species in the known galaxy. Within minutes, the ship transformed into a coordinated war machine as crew members rushed to battle stations and Olivia Grant the weapons specialist had indeed been working secretly with Ember on a revolutionary new system. Olivia had created modified weapons that used Ember starfire as a power source, and the rounds they fired were infused with magical dragon flame, which meant they could actually damage beings that existed partially outside normal space and time. When the Void Collective attacked with overwhelming force, they discovered something they had never encountered before, which was magic and technology working together, in perfect harmony and backed by species that had both survived extinction. Ember launched herself from the cargo bay, and her massive golden form weaved between the shadow ships while her flames burned through their hull structures that were made of condensed darkness and stolen reality. Lyra and Mira stood at weapon control stations and channeled their ancient elven magic directly through the ship electronic systems, which turned ordinary human missiles into devastating spells that could tear through multiple dimensions simultaneously. The battle was brutal and swift and filled with violence, but the Void Collective began to retreat after suffering losses they had not anticipated, and their leader sent a final transmission promising that this was not over. The shadow being said that humans had made an enemy of the eternal darkness itself, and Jacob replied coldly to get in line before cutting off the transmission with a sharp gesture. In the aftermath of the battle, the crew celebrated their unlikely victory with relief and exhaustion. But Jacob stood alone in the observation deck, staring out at the stars with a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. Lyra found him there and said softly that he had changed everything because the Void Collective had never retreated from a battle before in their entire ancient existence, spanning thousands of years across the galaxy. Jacob replied that they had not achieved victory alone, and that was the entire point of building an alliance. Because Lyra people had fought alone against the Void and lost everything while humanity had only survived. He explained that humans were too stubborn to know when they were truly beaten and too loyal to ever abandon their allies. And together, maybe, they actually stood a real chance against an enemy that had seemed invincible. Lyra said they needed to make sure they were ready for the next battle because the Void would return with greater force, and they would bring everything they had to eliminate this new threat to their dominance. Jacob nodded in agreement and said that humanity would need to ensure they were not the same people when the Void came back, and they would need to grow stronger, faster, and smarter with each passing day. Far away, in the darkness between stars where light could not reach, the Void Collective gathered their forces and discussed this unexpected development with concern and growing anger at their first defeat. They had suffered their first significant loss in thousands of years, and the humans had achieved the impossible by uniting magic and science and dragon and soldier and elf and human into a force that could hurt them. The Void leaders decided this was a problem that needed to be eliminated permanently, and completely before other species across the galaxy learned that the eternal darkness could actually be challenged and defeated. Back on the Valiant, Ember settled into her cargo bay quarters and sent her mental voice to both sisters, saying that the real war was only just beginning, and they needed to prepare for battles that would make today. Lyra agreed silently and watched through the viewport as repair crews worked on damaged sections of the hull. And she knew that every species in the coalition would need to contribute everything they had. Mira joined her sister at the viewport and said quietly that for the first time in centuries she felt something she had thought lost forever, which was genuine hope for a future beyond mere survival. The twins had waited 7 days for a human to keep his promise, and in doing so they had found not just rescue, but a new family and a purpose worth fighting for against the consuming darkness. Kate Morrison approached the sisters and asked if they would continue her combat training tomorrow because she wanted to learn everything they could teach her about fighting enemies that existed between dimensions. Lyra smiled and said they. The twin elven sisters stood at the edge of the crystalline cliff, watching the purple sky darken with approaching storms of destruction, and Lyra clutched the small metal device in her trembling hand, while its red light blinked steadily like a heartbeat that refused to stop beating. 7 days had passed since the human had given them this device and made his promise to return for them and their dragon companion. But now, as the seventh sunset painted violent colors across their dying world, Lyra felt her hope beginning to crack like the ground beneath their feet. Mira stood beside her twin sister, and her silver hair whipped wildly in the cold wind that swept across the barren landscape, and she whispered that perhaps the human would not come back after all. But even as she spoke those words, her voice carried more hope than true belief in what she was saying. The dragon ember released a low rumble from deep in her chest, and smoke curled from her nostrils as she scanned the darkening sky with her ancient golden eyes that had seen centuries of war and destruction and death across their world of Ethermore. Their world was dying, and had been dying for many years now, because the ancient war between the 5 great elven kingdoms had torn reality itself apart and created massive rifts in space that swallowed entire cities whole and turned mountains into floating debris. In the empty void between dimensions, Lyra and Mira were the last survivors of the once proud house of Starweave, and their people were either scattered across dying worlds or already dead, and their beautiful castle was nothing more than broken stones floating in the darkness of space where solid ground used to exist. 7 days ago, a human ship had crashed through one of the dimensional rifts that surrounded Ethermore, and the pilot had stumbled from the burning wreckage with terrible burns covering half his body and face, and he could barely stand on his own 2 feet. Pilot was a man named Jacob Hayes, and while most beings would have run away from strangers or attacked them out of fear, the twin sisters had instead chosen to heal him using their ancient magical powers that had been passed down through countless generations of their noble house. They channeled their healing energy through the flames of their dragon ember, because starfire dragon flames had unique properties that could seal wounds that normal magic could not touch, and slowly over many hours, they managed to save the dying human pilot from certain death. When Jacob finally regained consciousness and strength, he looked at the sisters with his steady gray eyes and made them a promise that would change everything for all of them. And he said he would come back for them in exactly 7 days with help and ships to rescue them. He promised that both sisters and their dragon would have a place among his people, and they would never have to face destruction alone again. And all they had to do was wait at this exact spot for 7 days, and he would return no matter what obstacles stood in his way. Now those 7 days had passed, and the sisters waited as another massive rift opened in the distance and swallowed an entire mountain range with a sound like reality itself was screaming in agony and pain, and the ground shook violently beneath their feet from the impact. Lyra said firmly that they would wait 1 more hour because she refused to give up hope, even though every logical part of her mind told her that the human had probably died trying to return, or had simply forgotten about 2 elven refugees and their dragon companion. Mira nodded in agreement, and Ember coiled her massive-scaled body around both sisters to provide warmth against the gathering cold of their dying world, and they had survived the death of their entire family and the destruction of their ancient home, and they could survive 1 more hour of waiting. The minutes passed slowly, like drops of water falling from a frozen cliff, and even Lyra, who had held onto hope the longest, began to feel her resolve wavering under the weight of disappointment and the reality that perhaps humans were no different from all the other races they had met. Perhaps humans were full of pretty words and empty promises just like everyone else they had encountered in their long lives, and perhaps trusting a stranger had been the final mistake that would cost them everything they had left, including their lives. Then suddenly Ember lifted her massive head, and her golden eyes focused on a specific point in the darkening sky above them, and a tear in space appeared. But this tear was different from the chaotic rifts that were destroying their world, because this one was controlled and precise and geometric in its perfect formation. Through the controlled rift came ships, and not just one ship, but dozens of them, and they all bore the same military insignia that had been painted on the side of Jacob Hayes' crashed vessel 7 days ago when he had first arrived on their dying world. The largest ship descended through the atmosphere with careful precision, and a metal ramp extended from its side with a hissing sound of hydraulics and pressure systems, and then Jacob Hayes walked down that ramp now wearing a pristine military uniform instead of burned and tattered clothes. Behind Jacob came a medical team carrying equipment and supplies, but he was looking only at the twin sisters with an expression of relief and determination on his human face, and he said with a tired smile that he was sorry for being late to their meeting. He explained that he had to convince his entire military command structure that 2 elven warriors and a starfire dragon were worth starting an intergalactic incident over and breaking about 50 different regulations and protocols. But it turned out he could be very persuasive when he was stubborn enough. Lyra felt hot tears streaming down her face as she held up the still blinking device, and she said with a breaking voice that he had actually come back for them, just like he promised. And Jacob said simply that he had made a promise, and he always kept his promises no matter what. He urged them to hurry because they had approximately 10 minutes before the planet Ethermore would tear itself apart completely, and he would really prefer if all of them were far away when that catastrophic event happened to their world. The sisters and their dragon boarded the human ship, and Ember barely fit through the massive cargo bay doors even though they had been specially modified to accommodate large beings and creatures, and the ship lifted off just as the surface of Ethermore began its final collapse into nothing. Through the viewport window, Lyra and Mira watched their ancient world die in a spectacular explosion of light and dimensional energy, and chunks of their planet scattered across space like tears falling from the eyes of the universe itself. They watched everything they had ever known disappear forever. But for the first time in many long years of war and suffering, they were not watching alone, because they had found allies who kept their promises even when it was difficult and dangerous to do so. Mira turned to Jacob and touched his arm gently and asked him why he had risked everything for strangers he barely knew and had only spent a few hours with before leaving their world 7 days ago. Jacob looked at her with those steady gray eyes that seemed much older than his relatively young human face, and he said that they had risked everything to save him when they did not have to, and they could have left him to die in his crashed ship. Added that humanity was going to need all the allies they could possibly find, because they had just started a war they did not even know existed until recently, and he had a strong feeling that the twin sisters knew quite a lot about war and fighting. The ship accelerated away from the dying planet and jumped into faster-than-light travel, and carried them toward a future that none of them could have predicted, but that all of them would face together as allies, and eventually as something much more like family. Jacob explained during the journey that humanity had encountered the Void Collective for the first time only months ago, and had barely survived that first contact with beings that existed partially outside normal reality and consumed entire civilizations. The Void Collective was the same enemy that had manipulated the Elven kingdoms into their devastating civil war and had fed on the resulting chaos and destruction for decades, until nothing remained but scattered refugees and broken worlds floating in space. Now humanity had made themselves a target by fighting back against the Void instead of hiding or running away like most other species had done throughout galactic history. And they needed experienced warriors who understood how to fight enemies that existed between dimensions. Lyra realized as she listened to Jacob speak that their rescue was not just an act of kindness, but also a strategic decision, because humanity needed knowledge and expertise that only survivors of Void attacks could provide to their relatively young civilization. But even knowing that did not diminish the fact that Jacob had kept his promise, when he could have simply fled to safety and left 2 elven sisters and a dragon to die with their world, and that act of honor meant everything to beings who had lost faith. Mira asked what would happen to them now, and Jacob smiled and said they would help train human soldiers in combat techniques and share their knowledge of the Void Collective. And in return, they would have a home among humans for as long as they wanted. He added that Ember would probably become the most popular being on the entire human fleet, because nobody had ever seen a real dragon before, and children would absolutely love her. And the dragon rumbled with amusement at the thought of being admired by tiny human younglings. As their ship approached the main human fleet, Lyra looked at the hundreds of vessels gathered in,